Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Bridget. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm very pleased that we're talking today to Professor Nicole Constable. She's Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's contributed to the special issue that's edited by Heath Cabot and Georgina Ramsey on displacement, and thinking about enabling us to think about migration in a different and one might say a more expansive way than is often the case in migration studies. So I'm delighted that we can talk to Nicole about her contribution to the special issue today. So Nicole wrote a paper called Passports, Precarity and Labour. So I wondered, Nicole, if we could start by you telling us something about the research that your paper draws on.
My pleasure. So the beginning of this project was a little bit strange. I was introduced by a former Indonesian domestic worker in Hong Kong to an Indonesian consular official. And I was very surprised because the consulate officials had not wanted to talk to me on my earlier projects. And this new official had told her, because he knew she knew me, and had asked for her to arrange a meeting. So I was surprised and went to his office, and he had all of my books sitting on his tea table, and he essentially said he had invited me there because he wanted to tell me about the new consular passport project. And so I had never heard of this project before, but it was 2015, and it had been the start of a new approach to renewing passports of all the Indonesians in Hong Kong. And there are about 150,000 of them in Hong Kong at that time. And the idea was to bring them into the future, bring Indonesia into the future by introducing these biometric passports and having biometric data collected for all of the people who came to renew their passports. And while I was there, he said, I want you to write a book about this, or to think about writing a book on this topic. I've read your book on the Born Out of Place, and I want you to do what you did for them about this passport project, because he thought it was really important and groundbreaking and all that. And he said, and maybe I should co-author it with you. And I said, I was really taken aback because I had not even known about this project before. And I said, well, as an anthropologist and as someone who's clearly read my earlier work, you know that I would have to present multiple sides, and that I think my credibility might not be great if I co-authored with you. So I don't think that would be possible. But I remember being really taken aback and uncomfortable about that. And then I said, but would you still think it's a project worth doing, even if I didn't co-author with you? And he agreed. So I decided that I'd think about it. And then eventually I decided I would do research on this project, which was very different from any project I'd done before. But the research then was every summer from 2015 on. Well, I spent most summers in Hong Kong doing research anyway, but I started studying this and talking to activists and talking to workers. And at that point, the situation started really heating up with workers getting into trouble over their passports. And I'll preface it by saying that in the decades that I spent doing work in Hong Kong, it had become clear to me that up to possibly half of the Indonesian workers I knew had what might be called irregular passports. And the idea was that the passports were real and they were issued by government offices, but the contents of the passports may not be what they considered their real identities. So if I was interviewing someone, even for earlier projects, before I even thought of the passport projects, I would say, so what's your age? What name shall I call you? And they say, do you want the real one or do you want the one in my passport? And so this over the years became a really interesting issue to me. And that's kind of the birth of that project. So
you spoke to Indonesian domestic workers.
I talked to mostly consular officials of various sorts. I talked to many domestic worker activists, and I talked to many domestic workers who I'd talked to before about their passports, as well as some new ones who were being investigated and either had been to court or were in the process of going through court procedures in Hong Kong against their, or for the problem of identity fraud and knowingly falsifying their identities. So what was fascinating to me about this was that this got people in really serious trouble in some cases. Many people have these false identities, and various studies, sort of surveys done by domestic worker activists themselves, have shown that a lot of people have these irregularities. But the reasons they have them are often tied to what happened to them back in Indonesia and how the recruiters or the brokers, in some cases, coerced them or pressured them or told them this is just what everyone does. If you want to work abroad, this is how you do it. And you just need to take this passport, or find an older sibling or find an older friend and get their school papers so that you can get a passport. And so most people in Indonesia don't have these papers. They don't have birth certificates. The rural people from Central and East Java are not likely to have all the documentation that you need to get a passport. So they would do what the respected elder broker would tell them to do. And then the broker would talk to the people at sometimes these small out of the way government offices that would then give them the passports with a new name or place of origin or birth date on them. And then they would use them. And a few women would tell me stories about how once they got to the airport to go for their job, they saw that the name was wrong or the birth date was wrong, and they'd say something, and the recruiter or the agent would tell them, well, if you don't go, you don't have to go, but then you owe us this huge amount of money that they could never have any hope of paying back. So the part that was really disturbing was that the women themselves saw it as it wasn't their fault, even if they were well aware of it. But from the perspective of the Hong Kong Immigration Department, it was their fault because they had knowingly come to Hong Kong with a false identity. And then the part that really was upsetting to the domestic workers was that the Indonesian consulate could do very little, or was willing to do very little, it seemed from their perspective, to help them. And so the women, the part that's quite interesting is that assuming a third of them had irregularities in their passports, the vast majority were never found out. Because if they'd only ever had one passport, or if it hadn't gone into the electronic system from the office where they got the passport, it might never be discovered. But for the ones who had traveled with more than one passport, because they expire so quickly, and with working with different agencies, they might then get a different passport. There are lots of ways that they could get irregular identities. So by doing this project, the Indonesian consulate either should have known that there'd be a huge number of people who would never get real identities because it wouldn't show up, or that the ones who did would get into trouble. But they had informally talked to the Hong Kong counterparts, the immigration department, before they started this project. And informally, their counterparts had said, oh, okay, we understand it's just an administrative cleanup. There's no problem underneath this, because they didn't know of that. And so then when women started getting reported and investigated and taken to court, they were a bit shocked. But the consulate would say, well, it's a relatively small number, but to the women themselves, any number is too big. And
Yeah.
there weren't only the ones who went to jail and who were investigated, but there were thousands of others who chose to leave Hong Kong because they were afraid that if they renewed their passports there would be trouble or they'd be found out. So that the bigger disruption was much more than to just the dozen or more who ended up in prison, or who I knew went to prison.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. So that's a bit like, Nicholas de Geneva's argument about deportability, about the consequences of the fear of deportation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I know that you're kind of critical of the imagined sharp division between the migrant and the citizen, the migrant and citizen binary. Can you tell us something about what your criticism is of that?
Yeah, so the main point I'm trying to make, and I was realizing maybe this has to do with my own background, because I only fairly recently in my life, relatively, became a US citizen. So for the longest time, I was both a non-citizen of the US, but I was a citizen of another place. And how this question of how citizenship and non-citizenship in one place, in one person, are relevant to your life. People tend to look at either your citizenship or your non-citizenship, but they don't look at both together normally, or take the two as being part of the same person or groups of people. They take one or the other. So I had read, and I'm familiar with your work and Janine Dahinden's work on the critique of the citizen-migrant binary and how that's used and promoted, and how it creates and reifies this kind of insider-outsider status. But what struck me, and how that's very problematic, but what I wanted to look at then is how both citizen and non-citizen identity, if you look at them both at the same time, how that can trouble the binary. And so the book that I'm writing it's called Passport Entanglements, and it's about, the subtitle is Protection, Care, and Precarious Migration. It looks at all these different binaries, from care and control, real and fake, migrant and citizen, state and society, and troubles all of those binaries. So I've always been very interested in entanglements and problematizing. And so the literature on the critique of migrant and citizen binary is something that I'm really interested in. And then the way that Georgina and Heath added displacement to it and exceptionalizing displacement was very exciting to me and very challenging as well. Because my first thought was, I'm interested in how so-called migrants and so-called citizens actually share interests and can both be seen as displaced or as precarious in certain ways. But then I realized, well, I haven't studied the locals who are involved with migrant workers in the same way. So I think one of the reviewers wanted me to have the distinction be more clear in relation to employers and workers and their shared precarity. And that wasn't at all what I wanted to do, because I was interested in really looking at citizen and non-citizen as the critique of the migrant citizen binary. and to look at them together, how your citizenship and your non-citizenship, even though of course that's not the whole picture. There's a whole bunch of other factors, including, for the domestic workers, there's brokers, and the history is important, and the wider capitalist situation, and all that comes into play in their situation. And I'd say in all situations, but that critique is basically to look at how these Indonesian workers in Hong Kong, as legal visa holders in Hong Kong, but Indonesian citizens, how in fact neither the Hong Kong state nor the Indonesian state look after them in the way that they expect or need at the point at which this emergency surrounding the passports took place. So the passports become a location in which to clearly see how citizenship and non-citizenship both play a really important and connected role, so that their Indonesian consular office, which they truly thought should be looking out for them, taking care of them, and who even claimed that the Passport Project was a way to take care of migrant workers, that it ended up being precisely what prevented them from getting the care they needed and created the whole problem. And the Hong Kong side of it, again, they were interested in flexible workers. So putting a few workers in prison or sending some home is not going to hurt their chances. I mean, they will make some employers angry, and it did, but it doesn't mess up the larger system of having flexible labor come into Hong Kong, and cheap flexible labor.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I like, I'm looking forward to the book, by the way. I think what I like about your work and is precisely the ways in which, on the one hand, it's very rooted in, in particularities. And then on the other hand, it also speaks to these kind of massive concepts. And I suppose, you're an anthropologist, so we should expect that. But I really find that kind of speaks to me really clearly. So it renders these entanglements, this kind of conceptual work, I think very accessible as well. You can see why it really matters. And so just thinking about the particularities, and as you say, in the context of the special issue, which is on displacement, I wondered if you could fill in for me the historical context of the displacement that's experienced by the Indonesian migrant domestic workers that you worked with.
Yeah, so I've been reading more Indonesian history recently, and there's both the distant history and the more recent history. So it's no coincidence that a lot of the domestic workers in Hong Kong and in other parts, other women who go abroad to work, are from Central and East Java, which are some of the most population dense and some of the poorest regions. And part of this is linked, as I understand it, to the colonial history of the gradual destruction of small-scale farming and agriculture, and the gradual growth beginning during the colonial period, but continuing beyond it, to sort of the growth of industrial and corporate agriculture, and the mobility, forced mobility or strongly encouraged mobility or coerced mobility of laborers to particular regions for plantations and other areas where they need laborers. And so that the poverty that went along with the so-called development, and that then became exacerbated in the 1990s with the Asian financial crisis and the World Bank and IMF restructuring, that exacerbated those kinds of problems. So what you have are rural areas that are very poor, where there are relatively few opportunities for work other than, very local, small scale, low paid things to do. And where as these global opportunities for care work and for domestic work grew, and they had existed much longer in the Middle East, but then in East Asia for Indonesians. But then as the opportunities in East Asia developed as well, Indonesians then gradually in the 90s joined Filipinos who had already been working in Hong Kong and in Taiwan and other places, and took up the jobs there as well. And these jobs were, it's so interesting, one little thread of the continuity is that in Java, there were a lot of businesses that were involved in pilgrimage and sending people on pilgrimage. And some of the buildings where the Indonesian pilgrims would be housed before they would go abroad on pilgrimage to Mecca have been transformed into dormitories and training centers for domestic workers. And so, and it's no coincidence that the earlier ones were going to the Middle East to work, but now it's branched off into this huge, huge business opportunity with the promotion of these workers being, well, they're recruited and it's a huge money-making operation for both recruitment and placement. And it includes these small-scale brokers and others on the community level, as well as these large businesses that are often tied to government interests and government kin and family members who have invested in them as well. And so the history of mobility and labor mobility in Indonesia, and of sort of the poverty in some of these rural areas that many of the women who work abroad where they originated are all part of this wider picture that contributes to the labor abroad and the difficulties that they face. But one of the points is that the displacement of these women, in the sense of not just a physical mobility, but a kind of existential dislocation and crisis, begins even before they leave Indonesia. So that displacement is not just being in a different place. And this is what I think Georgina and Heath helped me to really, really think about, is that it's a kind of existential crisis and sense that you don't have a future, that you can't see where the future is going. And I think that happens to the rural poor in Indonesia, even before they go abroad to work to some extent. And there are lots of steps at which they don't know what's happening, like when they're put into these camps and for training, but they aren't allowed to have contact with their families and others. And so by the time they're in Hong Kong, and then they start settling into Hong Kong and feeling, in some cases they feel at home, in some places they feel comfortable, in some they just feel like it's a job they're putting up with, but they can see how it could possibly lead them to a future of saving money and then returning home in a better situation, which of course is more the dream than it is the reality in many cases. But then they're in Hong Kong, and then suddenly it feels as though their own government is unable to protect them from the fear of not even having their jobs anymore. So then the number of people who are even let go by their employers from just the time it took them to get a new passport, and the number of times they had to go to the consular, to the embassy or to the consulate to get their paperwork done and to then find new documents that had to support their passport identity that they claimed. And there were all these new bureaucratic requirements that seemed like it was creating obstacles for them instead of protecting them as such or making their lives easier. And so that's the sort of displacement that I think is more of a continual thing, but that comes out very clearly in relation to the passport project.
So I suppose, yeah, there are moments of extreme displacement, such as if you lose your job, or indeed if you're deported. So I suppose
if you're put in prison.
Yeah, being put in prison, those are kind of very, and I think people tend not to think about deportation as displacement, actually.
Yeah, well, I think what they thought of, from the people I talked to, it was they would have plans on how to, they would tell their parents in some cases that they were going to be traveling with their employer. And so if they didn't hear from them for several months, that would be what it was. And they even like borrowed money. So a friend would send the family money and not know that they were in prison. I mean, they were so devastated at the idea that, you know, in some cases, pious Muslim women, that they would be put in prison was just unimaginable to them. You know, and some were single parents and some were supporting their elderly parents and were worried that, you know, the parents would fall apart if they knew what was happening to them. So some were interviewed in the news and they made up names so that they wouldn't be recognized in their home communities and things like that. But the part that was especially striking to me, and I haven't really mentioned it yet, is the extent to which the activist domestic workers, some very famous ones like Eni Lestari and Sringatin, both of whom are just unbelievable activists, the extent to which their organizations, a variety of these Indonesian migrant worker organizations, and some partner organizations that are linked to Filipino domestic workers and others, would run educational sessions. They would use rooms in different universities on weekends and lecture to and present and have Q&As with all these different migrant worker leaders, even non-activist groups, you know, all kinds of organizations would come and get advice from these activists who were doing active research on these cases and collecting different stories, different scenarios, the questions that were asked in the interviews, and we're looking into all these different complicated scenarios of how to protect yourself and what your options were and what the pros and cons of each option would be. So they would do this in Victoria Park on Sundays, they would do it in different buildings, and the networks and the networking among these activists, including, you know, pro bono lawyers locally, politicians back in Indonesia who were sympathetic to their cause. And they moved heaven and earth to get things changed and to get the policy eventually temporarily altered so it would go back to what it originally was, by having top ministers from Indonesia eventually came to Hong Kong to meet with the Hong Kong acting chief executive at the time and to try to come up with a memorandum of understanding, which never did really go through. So the Indonesian consulate had to back down and ultimately change their policy. But that's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, it's fascinating. Because the other thing that I think is really interesting about your article is the way that you use the lens of displacement to help us compare the experience of Hong Kongers and Indonesian workers. And I thought that was really innovative. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, because that was controversial. One of the reviewers was really critical of it, but I did find it important and for me, very thought-provoking to think about what I saw as the displacement of Hong Kong people, at least a lot of people who I knew, in relation to the situation in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020, following the anti-extradition protests and the pro-democracy protests and the, in a sense, anti-China protests, that many people saw it as very much breaking with the promise of one country, two systems. But what you've got in the case of the Hong Kongers are people who mostly have Chinese passports, and then some who have the British overseas passports, but who felt as though their Chinese citizenship and their Hong Kong identity and their Hong Kong permanent residence were in conflict. And so, unlike the case of the domestic workers whose displacement is linked to a large extent to their economic precarity, but not only that, also to their citizenship and non-citizenship, for these Hong Kongers, the ones who are more critical of mainland China and don't want to be under their control and don't feel like they're Chinese citizens, even if they hold Chinese passports, that they felt as though the ground was taken out from under them and they no longer felt at home. They could no longer see that future that they had imagined, in the same way that the Indonesian workers could no longer clearly see their future when they're worried about ever, possibly being in jail, owing even more money than before, possibly, being sent home in shame. But so for the Hong Kong people, it's not necessarily an economic issue. It's linked to their idea of being simultaneously citizens and non-citizens and not feeling at home in a very deep existential way. So it's this displacement is similar but different, and it kind of begs all kinds of comparisons. And it also addresses the issue we were talking too much earlier about non-citizenship and citizenship, because citizenship is always limited, and so it contains within itself elements of non-citizenship. And so that's, again, the entanglement, the ways in which these binaries of migrant and citizen, or of sort of displacement belonging to the crisis of asylum seekers and refugees alone, is just highly problematic.
Yeah, so that opens up a whole new conversation, which maybe we can have when you launch your book, which I'm really looking forward to. When is it going to be out?
Well, it's under review, and I've asked a couple of friends to review it too, so that it can be, I can put in things that I've been thinking about, but probably not conceptualized deeply enough yet. So I'll probably have it done by the end of the summer, and then hopefully have it out in a year or so after that.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been fascinating.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely talking with you.